Brothers and sisters of Africa, something powerful is happening in the heart of the Sahel. It's not another military alliance. It's not a summit of speeches that fade after the applause. No, this time it's something different, something deeper, because for the first time in modern history, Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré and Mali's Colonel Assimi Goïta have come together, not to talk about war, but to declare economic defense. That's right. Two young leaders, two soldiers who rose from the ashes of chaos, are now crafting the foundation of a united Sahel economy, one designed to break Africa's dependence on Western control. The scene was set in Ouagadougou. Cameras flashed, reporters gathered, and the air was thick with anticipation. But unlike typical state meetings, there was no polished stage, no rehearsed smiles. Just two men in uniform, eyes steady, hands firm, and the flags of Mali and Burkina Faso standing side by side. The crowd waited in silence. Then Traoré stepped to the podium and said in his firm, calm voice, "We have defended our land with courage. But now, we must defend our economy with wisdom. The same independence we fought for with arms, we will now build with trade, industry, and unity." Those words sparked thunderous applause. And Goïta, standing next to him, added, "No foreign power should decide the price of our labor, our gold, our resources, or our future. Mali and Burkina Faso will now protect their wealth like they protect their borders." It was a declaration, not of war but of liberation. They called it the Joint Economic Defense Initiative, or JEDI. The name quickly went viral across Africa. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, social media flooded with one message: Africa is learning to defend its economy. But what exactly was this economic defense? It wasn't just talk about money, it was about power. For decades, Burkina Faso and Mali had been trapped in a web of external influence. Their gold mined but refined elsewhere. Their cotton exported raw and imported back as expensive fabric. Their currencies tied to France's CFA franc, limiting their independence. And when these nations tried to change course, they faced sanctions, isolation, and even covert destabilization attempts. But Traoré and Goïta knew one thing: Africa's greatest war was no longer being fought on battlefields. It was being fought in banks, contracts, and trade deals. So they crafted a plan. Over the next 6 months, Burkina Faso and Mali would launch a joint economic command council, coordinating trade, energy, and resource policies. Create a Sahel Development Fund to pool revenue from gold, agriculture, and exports. Begin shifting away from the CFA franc toward a regional currency backed by gold and natural resources. And most importantly, develop infrastructure routes linking their economies directly, cutting out foreign intermediaries. It was bold, it was defiant, and it terrified the West. Within hours of the announcement, Western news outlets began their predictable chorus. Analysts warn of instability. Experts say Mali and Burkina Faso risk economic collapse. IMF expresses concern over fiscal recklessness. But inside Africa, it was a celebration. In Bamako, young Malians waved flags and chanted souveraineté économique, economic sovereignty. In Ouagadougou, people filled the streets shouting Traoré Goïta nos défenseurs, our defenders. And across African Twitter, the hashtag #economic defense began trending. It wasn't just a policy move, it had become a symbol of hope. Because for the first time, Africa wasn't reacting, it was acting. Not waiting for Western aid, not begging for approval, but standing up chest out saying, "We will build our own path." Yet behind the cheers, the leaders knew the danger that awaited. Economic independence has always been Africa's most dangerous dream, because it threatens the foundation of Western control. And sure enough, as the sun set on that historic day, hidden meetings began thousands of miles away. In Brussels, in Washington, in Paris, discussions quietly opened. Diplomats whispered, "How do we deal with this new Sahel bloc?" But neither Traoré nor Goïta cared. They had already seen what happens when Africa depends on outsiders, and they were done repeating history. As the evening fell, Both leaders met privately over a simple wooden table. No press, no cameras, just two patriots, two friends. Traoré looked at Goïta and said, "We defended our land together. Now we defend our people's future together." Goïta nodded and replied, "This time no one divides us. We hold the same line from Bamako to Ouagadougou." That's how it began, a new kind of alliance, a new kind of resistance, not with bullets but with economics. And while the world tried to understand what had just happened, Africa knew exactly what it was witnessing: the birth of the Sahel Economic Defense Front. The news spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, the declaration by Traoré and Goïta had reached every corner of the African continent, from the bustling markets of Lagos to the quiet rural villages of Chad. It wasn't just a political announcement. It was a statement of awakening. For decades, African nations had been told that they were too poor, too unstable, too dependent to ever stand alone. They were told that without Western banks, their currencies would collapse. Without Western companies, their mines would close. Without Western aid, their economies would starve. But now 2 young leaders had stepped forward to say, "No more." And that phrase, "no more," echoed in the hearts of millions of Africans. Across universities, students began discussing economic freedom instead of foreign scholarships. In the streets, traders started refusing foreign middlemen and choosing local suppliers. Even in the diaspora, Africans living in Europe and North America, people began to send money not to consumer imports, but to investment projects back home. The shift was real. Burkina Faso and Mali, long considered small and struggling, had somehow ignited a continental movement. But change, especially change that threatens power, never comes without consequences. In Washington, a report was circulating inside the State Department. Its headline read, "Mali-Burkina Economic Pact, Emerging Threat to Western Influence in Africa." The memo warned that this new economic defense pact could trigger a domino effect, inspiring other nations to follow suit: Niger, Guinea, even Chad. In Paris, financial analysts at the Ministry of Economy and Finance held late-night meetings. One official was quoted saying, "If this alliance detaches from the CFA system, France's economic leverage over West Africa could evaporate within years." The unease was palpable, but while Western diplomats plotted in Ouagadougou, the atmosphere was electric. The capital city became a hub of optimism. Banners were hung across the streets reading, "Economic freedom begins here." Traoré's office received hundreds of letters daily from farmers, miners, and students, all pledging to support the national economic movement. In a televised address, Traoré spoke once again, his tone calm yet burning with conviction. "We have been told to wait for aid, to depend on loans, but aid is a leash and loans are chains. From this day forward, Burkina Faso will rise by its own strength, and those who stand with us will rise too." Goïta responded with his own message from Bamako. Economic defense means refusing to let others define our destiny. It means building schools with our own materials, training engineers with our own minds, and producing energy with our own hands. These were not just words. Within weeks, both nations began rolling out policies that shocked global observers. First came the Resource Sovereignty Decree, a law that required every mining company operating in Mali or Burkina Faso to reinvest at least 40% of its profits locally, in infrastructure or industry. Then came the Sahel Energy Initiative, a bold plan to link the electricity grids of both nations using solar corridors stretching from northern Mali to southern Burkina Faso, creating one of Africa's largest renewable energy networks. And finally, the most controversial move: they began preparing to exit the CFA franc, a currency long tied to France's control, and replace it with a regional gold-backed system. The announcement stunned the world's financial centers. CNN called it a dangerous gamble. Reuters described it as economic nationalism gone too far. But on African social media, the reaction was explosive. #Sahel Power began trending globally. Influencers, musicians, and intellectuals from across Africa began posting videos praising Traoré and Goïta for their courage. Memes emerged showing the two leaders as economic warriors, breaking the chains of neo-colonialism. And amid all this, something historic began to take shape. Other nations started paying attention. In Niamey, Niger's new transitional government expressed interest in joining the Economic Defense Initiative. In Guinea, military leader Mamadi Doumbouya praised the Sahel duo for their strategic vision. And even in Ghana and Senegal, opposition figures began echoing their message. Africa must defend its economy, not just its borders. It was becoming clear that this was no longer just a bilateral pact. It was the seed of a continental revolution. But revolutions are dangerous, and both Traoré and Goïta knew that enemies were already circling. Intelligence reports began to surface. Unidentified foreign NGOs were being investigated for economic interference. Strange money transfers were traced to local opposition groups suddenly organizing protests against the new currency plans. Rumors spread of Western intelligence agencies attempting to pressure neighboring countries to distance themselves from the Sahel alliance. But instead of retreating, the two leaders stood taller. In a joint statement, they declared, "We have no fear of isolation, for isolation by the West means connection with the rest of Africa." That line, poetic and sharp, became a rallying cry. And soon after, in a move no one expected, they announced a Sahel Economic Defense Summit, inviting leaders from across Africa to attend. The summit's theme: one continent, one economy, one destiny. For weeks, the world watched with anticipation. Would anyone actually show up? The answer came on a bright morning in Ouagadougou, when aircraft from Niger, Guinea, and even Chad began landing one after another. African flags filled the airstrip. African leaders shook hands. And for the first time in decades, an African-led conference was happening without Western observers in attendance. In that moment, something irreversible happened. Africa stopped asking for permission and started making decisions. And as the cameras rolled, Traoré stood before the crowd and delivered words that would be replayed across the continent for days to come. "We do not need to borrow our freedom. We only need to protect it. Economic defense is not war. It is self-respect." The audience erupted. Drums beat, voices shouted. It felt less like a conference and more like a revolution beginning right before the eyes of the world. But little did they know, the biggest challenge was yet to come. Because the more Africa united, the harder the world's old powers would try to divide it. And the battle for economic freedom was just getting started. The summit in Ouagadougou marked a new chapter in African history, but the aftermath was like stirring a hornet's nest. Within 72 hours, the Western media went into overdrive. Headlines from major outlets painted a grim picture. Economic chaos looms as African leaders reject IMF guidance. Burkina Faso and Mali risk isolation over radical economic pact. Every headline dripped with skepticism. Every panel discussion filled with experts warning about economic suicide. But back in Africa, the people saw something else: hope. Because for the first time, their leaders weren't bowing down to international pressure. They were standing tall, shoulder to shoulder. In the heart of Ouagadougou, murals of Traoré and Goïta appeared overnight. Artists painted them breaking chains, lifting Africa's map high above flames of oppression. Markets buzzed with conversation. Radio hosts began their shows with a new greeting: Sahel Strong. It wasn't just politics anymore. It had become a movement, a spirit that refused to be contained. But while the streets celebrated, inside government offices, reality began to hit hard. Both Burkina Faso and Mali were facing severe pushback from international financial institutions. The IMF abruptly postponed all ongoing talks. The World Bank paused several infrastructure loans, citing concerns about fiscal stability. Even major Western corporations began to pull back, freezing their investments and delaying shipments. It was clear the economic war had officially begun. In response, Traoré and Goïta launched what they called Operation Sovereign Supply. Their goal was to ensure that no foreign disruption could choke their economies. Burkina Faso began stockpiling essential goods, grains, fuel, medical supplies. Mali redirected military logistics to support economic transport routes. Together they formed a joint task force, not of soldiers this time, but of economists, engineers, and farmers, to design a survival blueprint. Within weeks, the results were astonishing. Local farmers, once struggling under cheap imports, suddenly found themselves in demand. Factories in both nations began increasing production of cement, textiles, and solar panels. And local markets, once dominated by imported Western goods, were now selling made in Burkina and made in Mali products. The shift was massive, and the people felt it. There was pride in buying local again. There was a sense of belonging to something bigger than any border. But of course, such defiance came with consequences. Foreign media began circulating rumors that Burkina Faso's economy was collapsing, that people were fleeing the country, that civil unrest was brewing. Yet when reporters actually visited, they found markets bustling, schools full, and construction sites running day and night. The truth was simple. Africa was changing, and the world didn't know how to react. Meanwhile, a secret meeting took place in Bamako. Traoré and Goïta sat across from one another, documents spread across a table, as advisors detailed a new phase of the alliance. The creation of a Joint Economic Defense Fund. The idea was revolutionary. A fund built from gold, natural resources, and contributions from friendly African nations that could act as a safety net against foreign sanctions. "Brother," Goïta said, his voice low but determined, "we must never again let our people suffer because of their courage." Traoré nodded. "Our people are rich in everything except belief in themselves. That belief we must restore." Their conversation lasted hours. By the end, they had signed a new document, the Sahel Economic Charter. It pledged that no African nation aligned with the Sahel Alliance would ever be left alone under foreign economic attack. It was, in effect, Africa's first mutual economic defense agreement. And once that announcement hit the airwaves, history was made again. News broke across the continent. Mali and Burkina Faso established Joint Economic Defense Fund. Leaders from Guinea and Niger praised the move. In Ghana, activists began calling for similar charters across West Africa. Even in South Africa, political analysts compared it to the foundation of BRICS, but purely African. However, the celebrations didn't last long. The U.S. Treasury quietly announced that several Burkinabe and Malian officials would be sanctioned for anti-democratic activities. France followed with new trade restrictions. And suddenly, Western aid organizations began withdrawing en masse, shutting down offices, canceling projects, and leaving headlines like "Western NGOs forced out by military regimes." But this time Traoré didn't flinch. He went on national television, his tone calm but firm. "If their help comes with strings, it is not help, it is control. Let them go. We will feed our people, heal our sick, and educate our children ourselves." That speech went viral overnight. Clips of it spread on TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube, reaching millions. Africans everywhere began repeating his words. "If their help comes with strings, it is not help, it is control." Western commentators mocked him. African citizens memorized him. And that's the difference between power and influence. One fades, the other grows. Then came the moment that changed everything. At the following Sahel summit, Traoré and Goïta unveiled a massive blueprint. The Sahel Industrial Corridor, a 1,200-kilometer economic route connecting Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger through highways, rail lines, and industrial zones. It was a symbol of independence, one that would no longer rely on Western ports or corporations. Instead, the Sahel would produce, transport, and trade within Africa. As the blueprint was revealed, applause thundered through the room. Delegates stood up chanting, "Sahel for Africa, Africa for Africans." It was no longer just about Burkina Faso or Mali. It was about an entire continent rediscovering its dignity. Outside, the crowd chanted Traoré's name, waving flags and singing songs about unity and courage. That night, under the dim glow of the presidential office lights, Traoré stared at a map of Africa pinned on the wall. He touched it softly, tracing the borders with his finger. "We were divided by others," he whispered, "but we will unite by choice." Behind him, Goïta stood silently for a moment before replying. "And this is just the beginning." The two men exchanged a brief nod. Outside, the drums of celebration rolled deep into the night. The Sahel had made its stand, and the world, whether it liked it or not, had to pay attention. The next morning, as the sun rose over the Sahel, a golden light swept across the red earth, glinting off half-built rail tracks, cranes, and solar farms. It wasn't just the dawn of another day. It was the dawn of a new Africa. Inside the presidential office, Traoré and Goïta stood together again, reviewing reports. The Sahel Industrial Corridor project was ahead of schedule, but that wasn't the most shocking update. It was the message that had just arrived from 7 other African nations, each declaring their intent to join the Sahel Economic Defense Pact. Among them were Chad, Guinea, Niger, and even Senegal, long seen as loyal allies of the West. It was official. Africa's tide had turned. While Western diplomats scrambled to make sense of it, African citizens were already celebrating. On social media, hashtags like Sahel Rising and Africa Unchained trended for days. Videos of Traoré and Goïta shaking hands went viral, set to music that blended traditional drums with modern beats. The sound of an old continent finding its new rhythm. But even in the midst of celebration, both leaders knew the storm was far from over. Intelligence briefings warned of covert operations, infiltration attempts, online propaganda, even sabotage of infrastructure. The West, having lost control of a key region, wouldn't simply walk away. Still, Traoré refused to waver. In a historic speech broadcast live across Africa, he stood before the Burkina parliament and said, "They used to say we are too poor to stand alone, but it is not poverty when you refuse to kneel. It is pride, and pride is the first seed of prosperity." His words hit harder than any weapon. Every sentence echoed across radios, televisions, and phones throughout the continent. For the first time in generations, young Africans weren't just hearing about leaders fighting for them. They were watching leaders stand with them. That same week, joint training programs began between Burkina and Malian engineers, soldiers, and entrepreneurs. New trade routes opened across the Sahel, and African banks began quietly exploring alternatives to the CFA franc, the colonial-era currency still controlled by France. Then something truly unprecedented happened. Representatives from Russia, China, and even India sent official envoys to Ouagadougou, not with demands but with offers. Infrastructure investments, energy partnerships, and defense collaborations were all on the table. The world's great powers had realized one thing: the Sahel wasn't just rebelling, it was rising. And as one Western diplomat was overheard muttering in frustration during a private briefing, "Traoré didn't just challenge us, he changed the game." Meanwhile, in the dusty heart of Burkina Faso, the ordinary people felt the impact. Farmers received subsidies from the new economic fund. Schools reopened with fresh materials printed locally instead of imported. And for the first time in decades, Burkina gold profits went straight into public projects, not foreign banks. There was still hardship, of course. Development takes time, and not every dream becomes reality overnight. But there was belief now, something far more powerful than aid or debt. Traoré's team began drafting plans for an African Sovereignty Summit, a gathering of nations committed to economic independence and mutual defense. He wanted it to be held not in a fancy capital city, but in Bobo-Dioulasso, Burkina Faso's cultural heart, to remind everyone that Africa's strength lies in its people, not in skyscrapers or suits. And as preparations began, invitations went out not just to presidents and ministers, but to farmers, students, women's cooperatives, and small business owners. It wasn't just a summit, it was a revolution in motion, led not by politicians, but by the people themselves. Meanwhile, in Washington and Paris, think tanks rushed to publish reports titled "The Sahel Shift: How Africa's New Leaders Are Redefining Global Power." The tone had changed, from arrogance to anxiety. They had underestimated 2 young soldiers who turned their nations into symbols of defiance and dignity. Weeks later, when the summit finally began, the scene was electric. African flags waved together. Drummers pounded out a rhythm of victory. Leaders from across the continent walked side by side, no longer divided by old colonial lines. Then, as the hall fell silent, Captain Ibrahim Traoré took the stage. He raised his hand and spoke, his voice steady, deep, and full of conviction. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "we are not gathered here to ask for permission. We are gathered to decide our own destiny. For too long, Africa's wealth has been her curse. But from this day, that curse becomes our strength. The world will no longer dictate who we are. We will." The crowd erupted in applause. Goïta stood and joined him, raising the Sahel Alliance flag high. At that moment, something shifted, not just in Burkina Faso or Mali, but in every African watching. It was the rebirth of confidence, the awakening of a continent that had waited centuries for this moment. And as night fell, fireworks illuminated the skis over Ouagadougou. Children danced in the streets. Old men wept. Women ululated with joy. For the first time in a long time, Africa didn't feel small, it felt limitless. Later that night, in a quiet moment after the celebration, Traoré looked up at the African sky, vast, dark, and full of stars. He smiled and whispered softly, "They thought we would remain silent, but now they will hear Africa roar." The next day, newspapers across the world carried the same headline: "Africa rises. Burkina Faso and Mali lead a new era of independence." And somewhere deep in the Sahel, the rhythm of drums echoed once more, the heartbeat of a continent reclaiming its destiny. Because this was no longer the story of rebellion. This was the story of rebirth. And for those watching, for those listening, for those who believe in Africa's rise, this is just the beginning. If you believe Africa's story deserves to be told by Africans, hit that subscribe button, and let's make history together.